Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Marcia Eli from the Center for Brooklyn History at the Brooklyn Public Library and BPL Presents, which is the library's arts and culture team. Tonight, we have the honor of hosting political scientists Barbara Walter and Tasha Philpot in a conversation about Walter's new book, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. How Civil Wars Start has been characterized as a wake-up call for our country. As Jennifer Zosley of the New York Times wrote, it's only by thinking about what was once unfathomable that we can see the country as it really is. I'm very eager to hear Professors Walter and Philpot pull back this curtain, but before I introduce them, let me share a few quick notes. First, we will put a link in the chat to the website of a Brooklyn bookstore, the community bookstore in Park Slope, so that you can, with a click or two, explore how civil wars start and purchase a copy from a small business if you're so inclined. Second, as with all of our programs, you have the option to closed captioning tonight. That button is at the bottom of your screen. And finally, I urge you to share your questions for Barbara Walter this evening. Type them into the Q&A box throughout the program, which is also at the bottom of the screen. Now, let me say a word about each of our guests and hand it off to them. Political scientist Barbara F. Walter is the Rohr Professor of International Relations at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California, San Diego. She is one of the world's leading experts on international security, civil wars, political violence, and terrorism. A life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Walter helps to run the award-winning blog, Political Violence at a Glance, and has written for the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, Reuters, and many others. Her earlier books include the award-winning Committing to Peace, Why Negotiations Fail, Reputation and Civil War, and Civil Wars, Insecurity, and Intervention. And Tasha Philpot is a professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin, where she is also affiliated with the Center for African and African American Studies, the Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis, and the Center for Women's and Gender Studies. Professor Philpot specializes in American politics with particular interests in African American politics, political psychology, public opinion and political behavior, political communication, and political parties. She has authored 3 books. The most recent is Conservative but Not Republican: The Paradox of Party Identification and Ideology Among African Americans. So welcome to you both. Please come and join me here. And I am so grateful that you are spending this hour with us tonight. I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcia.
So Barbara, I have been a lifelong Stephen King fan. So not a whole lot scares me, but I gotta tell you, your book is gonna give me nightmares.
Tasha, I promised my husband that my next book would be about butterflies and unicorns, because I really do feel like even I have PTSD after spending years with this material and years doing this sort of research. So I completely agree with you, and I'm sorry.
So one of the things I thought was interesting is that as political scientists, we usually write books that talk to each other.
Yeah.
What inspired you to write this book, which was amazingly eloquent and a page turner for a general audience?
Well, my first answer is going to be corny, and then I'll have a slightly longer answer. The short answer is I actually became an academic because I wanted to help make the world a better place. I never really wanted to talk just to academics, although, as you know, to make it in our career, that's what you have to do. But luckily, I'm now at a stage in my career where I can talk to a broader audience. And then the longer answer is I had the honor to serve on this task force run by the US government through the CIA. And I was on the task force from 2017 to the end of 2021. And our job was to come up with a predictive model about what countries around the world were likely to experience political instability and political violence. And we could talk about the model, if you want later on, but as I'm working on this model, we're not allowed to talk about the United States. We never discuss it. We never look at the United States. Our world is entirely in Southeast Asia and the Middle East and Africa. And as I'm working on this task force, I begin to see as a private citizen that the two big factors that we know emerge in countries in the lead up to civil war, pretty much no matter where they break out, were emerging here in the United States. And of course, we knew it on the task force. Academics who study this knew it, but citizens and our politicians didn't know this. So it was this sense of, it was kind of responsibility, which also sounds corny, but this sense that, here we have all this information. Here, we know the warning signs, which gives people time to do something about it, and somebody has to write this down and inform Americans about it.
So for those who haven't had a chance to pick up the book, and I feel awesome, can you just give us a brief overview of what you take us through in the book?
Okay. Yeah. So again, I spent my whole career studying countries that were not the United States. So I could tell you a ton about Syria and about Northern Ireland and about Mozambique. But really, until I wrote this book, I did not focus on the United States. And so, when we're on this task force, there were academics on the task force and there were data analysts on the task force. And the data analysts had asked, the experts on conflict, they're just like, okay, tell us what we know about, where civil wars tend to break out. And we basically just compiled all of the data and all of the research that we'd had. And we said, well, some studies think it's poverty. Some studies think it's economic inequality. Some studies think it's ethnic diversity. And we put over 30 of these different variables into a predictive model. And we weren't really sure what would come out. And it turns out that only 2 of all of these factors came out consistently predictive. And it was not the ones that we expected. We, as the experts, were surprised by this. And the 2 big factors were something that we called anocracy. And that is just a fancy political science term for governments that are neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic. There's something in between. You could think about them as, partial democracies. Fareed Zakaria has called them illiberal democracies. So they have features of democracies, but they have some features of, more authoritarian regimes. That was the first factor and the most important one. It turns out that full democracies, the ones like the Denmarks, the Switzerlands of the world, they almost never experience civil wars. But full autocracies also rarely experience civil wars. The violence and the instability happens in the middle. And then the second big factor is what we call the rise of ethnic factions. And ethnic factions ethnic factionalism happens when a country's population, where people in these anocracies begin to organize politically, not around ideology. So you don't have a communist party or a liberal party, but they begin to organize strictly around identity. So you have a Serb party, you have a Crow party, or you have a Catholic party, you have a Protestant party, and it's identity that comprises, who you vote for. And then these particular types of identity parties, their goal is to get power, not to share it with other groups, but to actively exclude them from power. So of course, I'm on the task force. I see these 2 factors as being really important. And you would think that we were coming up with these two factors by looking at what's happening here in the United States. And we never, ever talk about the United States. So I was like, oh my God, it's happening here in my own country. So those are the two really big, important factors, more so than anything else.
So you open up the book with a discussion of, well, first the failed attempt to kidnap the governor of Michigan,
Yeah.
and then what happened during the resurrection or insurrection. I have a question. Had you started the book before those events happened, or was it like serendipitous that like you're working on this and oh my God, here it is, like, you know, unveiling in real time?
So I started writing the proposal for the book in 2017. It took me 2 years to write the proposal, and I submitted it in 2019. And then it took me another almost 2 years to write the book. The Whitmer piece, I actually wrote pretty well. It was supposed to be the opening for chapter 6. And chapter 6 is describing what's happening here in the United States. And then January 6th happened. And my editor emailed me and she's just like, you have to start chapter 6 with the January 6th events. And I was actually quite bummed because I liked the Michigan story, and it's such a powerful story. And it's a story that most people don't know or don't remember. And then sort of the compromise was, okay, we could start the book with that. So so part of it was, events were unfolding as I was writing the book, and thankfully it fit the framework for the book. And actually I wasn't so surprised. The first 5 chapters are really just, here's what we know from history. And it's just telling the story of other civil wars. And I think one of the things that's terrifying about the book is that as you're reading these chapters, which never mention the United States, you're seeing parallels and parallels and parallels. And it's impossible to read the story about Northern Ireland or Iraq or Ukraine and not realize that you've seen similar things happening here in the US.
As I was making my way through the book, I kept thinking about, I don't know if you watched This Is Us, but Beth and Randall are a married couple. And when something happens, they do worst case scenarios.
Yes.
If they go back and forth on what's the worst can happen. So I was thinking, can you take us through a couple of the worst case scenarios at this point? In the US context.
Yeah, I mean, I think the absolute worst case would be what I describe in chapter 7, which is kind of to try to help people visualize what such a war would look like. And of course, it's not going to look at all like what we saw in the 1860s. I mean, those types of civil wars, those are old time civil wars that almost never happen anymore. These two big armies meeting on a battlefield in uniform with each side has a general in charge. What we see today around the world, sort of the 21st century model of a civil war, is much more decentralized. It's more of an insurgency where you have lots of different militias who are fighting the government simultaneously, and sometimes they're working together, but sometimes they're actually fighting each other because they're in competition to dominate as well. And they almost always use unconventional tactics. And that would be something like guerrilla warfare or terrorism, where they're targeting civilians. You have a mass shooting in an African-American church in Detroit, or you have a bomb placed in a synagogue, or you have a sniper firing from a tower and picking people off, or they're targeting infrastructure, IKEAs or the electric grid, and really the goal is to be very dispersed, because that's much harder for even a powerful government with a powerful military to try to root out. And so these are wars where you don't want to engage soldiers, and the military directly, because that's a losing battle. So worst case scenario would be I mean, the analogy I think about, although this was not the start of it was different, but it produced the same feeling. Do you remember, Tasha, the morning of September 11th?
Absolutely.
Okay, everybody does. Everybody who is old enough to. And you remember turning on the television and it's like the world stopped and all the news anchors were up there and they're telling you, we've had 2 planes fly into the World Trade Center. We had a crash in Pennsylvania. We don't know how many more airplanes are in the air. All the airports are shut down. Nobody went to work. Nobody went to school. It just was this moment where you didn't know what was going on. You didn't know who was in charge. You didn't know how this was going to turn out. And it was really unnerving. And if you read the Turner Diaries is a fictitious account of a second civil war in the United States. But it's really a manual for how you would attack the federal government. And it's considered the Bible of the far right. And it very clearly lays out how you would do this. It includes an attack on the Capitol. It includes setting up a gallows, outside to have these, quick kangaroo courts where you then, assassinate opposition leaders. It lays out how this is going to happen. And one of the mechanisms that's behind it, how it's designed to work, is really to create confusion among the population, chaos, a sense of deep insecurity, and then what you oftentimes see happening in other countries is militias start to move into neighborhoods. They set up roadblocks. And so when people leave their house the next day, suddenly there's a roadblock and it's being guarded by, men in whose faces are covered wearing black, and there's no identification. They have machine guns and you don't know, is that the National Guard? Is that the military? Is that somebody else? And it's this sense, oh my gosh, the government doesn't have control. And then what they want to happen is for people to feel like they have to pick sides. So they, rather than seeing, the paramilitary group that is taking control of the streets as the enemy, suddenly people make the decision, well, they're here, they're the only ones who can protect me. We're gonna support them. And so it is this very strange dynamic. And it's based on trying to instill fear and insecurity in the population.
I remember, as it was talked about earlier, in one of my fields of expertise is political psychology. And so one of the things we have to read as part of that are things like the Milgram experiment, which look at why so many people who aren't part of the extremists kind of conform. And as I was reading your book, I kept thinking, given that we know that this is a blueprint, given that we know what's going on, and we can hear it and we can see it, and we have access to more information than we've ever had, why haven't the cooler heads prevailed? And it was funny too, because this week I was teaching the Federalist Papers, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
I'm going through Federalist 10 in particular, and I'm going through your discussion of Madison and Hamilton, and I started singing, of course. And I was wondering, like, at this point, we're not a dispersed population without access to each other. Why hasn't that tempered layer that Madison put into place not stepped in and said, okay, yes, we get, that there are tensions here, but ultimately this is going to undermine our entire democracy?
Oh, Tasha, that's a big, big question. I think it's because, well, you know more about this than I do, so jump in whenever you want. It's because the Republican Party made a deal with the devil in the 1960s. and they're now living with the consequences. So in the 1960s, when the Democrats and President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, he understood the implications of this. By promoting equal rights for African Americans, he was going to bring a lot of African Americans into the Democratic Party, but he was also going to alienate all the Southern white voters, many of whom were racist and had no interest in being in a party with non-whites. He was going to lose that, and they were called the Solid South. They voted consistently and reliably for the Democratic Party, and they did that in part because they were so angry at Lincoln for not allowing them to secede. And Lincoln was a Republican, so they said, okay, we're not voting for Republicans again. And they moved to the Democratic Party, and it catapulted the Democrats into power for decades. When Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, he turned to his aide and he said, I've just delivered the South to the Republicans for decades. And that's exactly what happened. It worked. The Republicans started gaining state houses. They started gaining a majority in the Senate. It really did help their political fortune in the short term. But it's now 2022, and they are the party of white Christians in a country that is multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and where the group in society that is growing the least are whites. And so if you're the Republican Party, you know that in a democracy with one person, one vote, if you continue to appeal predominantly only to whites and only to Christians, you cannot win in that system. And so their strategy moving forward is either we expand our tent and we be more inclusive, which they have shown no interest in doing, or we slowly and hopefully imperceptibly unravel our democracy so that we can cement in minority rule for many years to come. And so they're in this tough, I don't feel bad for them, this was their own choice, but they're in a situation where, in order to cater to their base, which is many of them believe that America is a white Christian country, should be a white Christian country. And as we saw on January 6th, they believe that they're justified in taking back this country for themselves, whether it's through legal, illegal, violent, nonviolent means. That's their base. And so they've chosen to double down and take the path towards less and less democracy rather than the path of widening their tent.
I keep going back to the guardrail analogy that you use throughout. And what do you think it would take for them to say, I'm not willing to go over those guardrails? I understand that there's power at stake, a power balance at stake, but I was sworn, for elected officials, was sworn to uphold the Constitution, and I'm not even adhering to the Constitution, let alone upholding it.
I would have thought it would have taken key leaders in the Republican Party. Mitch McConnell would be one who would lay down the gauntlet and said, enough. This is not acceptable. So where I was surprised was how quickly the Republican leadership fell lockstep behind Donald Trump. How quickly they have been to support the big lie that the election was stolen, that Donald Trump perpetrated. And that has been the big surprise, that I would have, one of the guardrails is Republican leadership, refusing to do the bidding of an autocrat within their own party. I mean, and especially after that, wannabe autocrat doesn't win an election, you would think at that point they would cut him loose. But they now have a party with voters who one have bought into the lie, and have this vision and image of what America should be, and it's more important to them that it look a certain way, and that one particular segment of society continues to dominate that, than democracy is to them. And that's the choice they're making. And I mean, I should emphasize, this is not unusual. In the research that I've done about other countries that experience ethnic civil war, we know who starts the wars. The people who start, the groups that start these wars are not the poorest people. They're not the most discriminated people. They're not the immigrants. These groups have no power. They're disempowered. They have no ability to organize, or if they are able to organize, they're quickly repressed. The groups that tend to start these wars are the groups that were once dominant politically and often economically, but are in decline, who see that demographics are changing, who see that they're losing status, and they are deeply, deeply resentful of the groups that are coming in. They're the ones that tend to start the wars. And of course, if you think about here in the United States, what group in the United States has been politically and economically dominant for our entire history? It has been whites, and there is a subset of the white population that sees, immigrants coming in, sees the identity of the country changing, and they are deeply resentful of that. They feel it is their right to control this country, and they're the ones who are mobilizing militias, and they're the ones who are storming the Capitol, and they're the ones who are reading the Turner Diaries, just like we see in other countries around the world.
So another question I have is, why now? So the dynamic that you've explained is not, I mean, it's almost completely indigenous to American culture, right? There's always been that fear of threat. It's why the Klan came about. It's why it came about again when we started seeing an influx of immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe and European countries. What's different in, the 2010s and 2020s that has, essentially fueled the fire, so to speak?
Yeah, Tasha, that's the most important question. And what's different today is, I think it probably became crystallized in the minds of this white subset of the population in 2014. What's different is we are in the midst of a radical demographic change, a shift. The US is going to be the first country to go from being a white majority country to being a white minority country, but Canada is going to be next, and New Zealand's going to come after that, and then Australia, and then the countries of Europe are anticipated to become minority white by about 2100. The US is the first country that's going to go through this transformation. And what crystallized it, and I think what sowed fear in the minds of many on the far right, was a census. I think it was in 2014. The 2014 census showed for the first time that a majority of babies born in the United States were non-white. And that threw that world into a tizzy, because prior to that, the focus was on immigration. Wow, if we can prevent brown people from coming to the United States, then whites will continue to be a majority, right? But the 2014 census revealed that even if they built a wall around the entire country and nobody was allowed in, the US was still going to become a non-white majority country by about 2045. And I think this terrified part of this group. If you remember back to the Charlottesville rally, when all these alt-right groups came together and they started marching and they had torches, they were chanting a few things. One of them was, "We will not be replaced. We will not be replaced. We will not be replaced." This is a demographic argument. We're not going to be replaced by non-whites. And another element which most people don't talk about is we're also not going to be replaced by women, right? These were men. We will not be replaced. And then what you saw in a lot of manifestos of mass shooters, the El Paso shooter, people who were targeting churches and synagogues, the manifestos often said something like, it's the birth rate, right? It's the birth rate. You have to now eliminate them. Actually, this is in a form of sort of ethnic cleansing, because that's the only way we can prevent this demographic change. And so why now? It's really because 20 years ago, America was 80%, over 80% white, and we hadn't really seen the effects of this change in immigration laws during the civil rights era, and it just seemed like America was going to be heavily white forever. But we have had this enormous change in demographics, and I think starting in 2014, the white population really, or a subset of it, really just it sunk in. Oh my gosh. And suddenly, if you can't win office demographically, and you can't, and stopping immigration will not help you, then violence starts to become potentially a viable option.
So talk to us about social media. I know that is one of the culprits you name in why this seems to be escalating.
Yeah, I mean, I think social media is an accelerant for three really big things that we're seeing: the decline of democracy, not just here in the United States, but across the world. Most people thought democracy was just going to continue to grow around the world, and it was never going to reverse. And it started to reverse around 2010. And a big nonprofit that studies democracy in Sweden called 2020 the year of autocratization, because we're seeing even the most sacrosanct liberal democracies around the world weakening. So we're seeing a decline in democracy that coincided with not just the rise of social media, but a series of decisions companies like Facebook made to preference the most incendiary type of information and push that information out there. We've also seen the rise of ethnic and religious nationalism and the rise of far-right ethnic parties. And again, we now have studies that show that hate-filled speech is I think 4 times more likely to be shared on Facebook than speech that's positive and unifying. And so we've seen the rise not only of far-right ethnic parties, but the rise of hate crimes. And then the third is social media makes it really, really easy to organize militias. If you go to Facebook, I went to Facebook when I was writing the book, and I typed in Arizona militias, and it gave me a whole list of Arizona militias that I could join. It was really amazingly, so I had to do none of the work. The platform and its recommendation engines does the work for me. And that's something new as well.
Again, I'm going to have nightmares.
Oh, I'm so sorry. We can talk about rainbows and butterflies at the end of this.
I know. So before I turn it over to audience questions, how do we fix this? Realistically, what needs to happen for us to not, throw out the baby with the bathwater
Yeah.
in terms of
So Tasha,
government
nobody wants
structure.
to talk about this, but the easiest thing that we could do right now is to regulate social media. The U.S. government regulates our meat industry. It regulates every other media outlet. But social media, gets a pass, and they get a pass because the tech companies are really powerful, and money matters in our politics. And the tech companies are savvy. They know that if they make the argument that it's First Amendment rights, that Americans don't want to touch that. And I think my response to that is, tech companies shouldn't be censoring information. Let people put whatever they want on the platforms. But the tech companies are responsible for scaling up the information and selecting out some of the worst information, and identifying people who are receptive to that message, and then pushing more and more extreme information that way. That is not only irresponsible, but we're seeing that it's having serious societal effects, really negative societal effects. And if this was any other industry, if the meat industry was consistently selling people meat that was bad and was making people sick, the government would step in. And I in our lifetime, probably in the next 5 or 10 years, we'll see this, because studies will show more and more definitively that social media is having these really negative societal effects. But right now, it's the Wild West, and we're living with the repercussions of that. So that's the most important thing. Strengthening our democracy, like full, healthy, strong democracies don't experience civil wars. Our democracy is not healthy. In fact, we have one party that's trying to weaken it. That's a really, really hard thing to change if one party doesn't want it to change, and in fact wants to weaken it further. And so we know Republican leadership is going to try to block any attempt to reform our democracy. And we now know that the Democrats don't have the votes to push through any reform. And so strengthening our democracy is not going to come from the top down. And then that means it's going to have to come from the bottom up. And how do average citizens get politicians to listen to them? They do this through peaceful protest, which is very effective. African Americans know that, they were able to get significant reforms after being almost entirely disenfranchised. And they did this through, very careful and lengthy protest process. And I think the can really learn from that, if your politicians aren't listening to you, if you're not seeing the reform that you want, going out in the streets and making your voices heard is hard for politicians to ignore over time. They'll try to ignore it for a long time, but it's hard to ignore over the long term.
So it's interesting that you bring up the case for African Americans, because the story is a little bit more complex than simple protests. I mean, it had to do partially with the ability to not just protest in a public manner, but also to negotiate with LBJ behind the scenes. But at the same time, it was embarrassing for the United States during the Cold War to have all of these images be transmitted throughout the world, because we were the beacon of democracy. And so when you said that, I thought, we don't have a sense of accountability. If the world is moving, like you're saying, away from democracy being the benchmark, then we don't have that, that mirror to look back into and say, okay, this is not who we are, on paper, at least, in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence.
But we can see our enemies taking advantage of our weakness, taking advantage of the divisions within our country. While the Republican Party is dysfunctional in many ways, while it's trying to unravel our democracy, while it's trying to exclude major portions of our population from power, Putin is watching this. Xi Jinping is watching this. This is an opportunity for them to exert their leadership on the world stage, but also to use us as an example for their own population of why they might not want democracy, because look how dysfunctional it is. So while our own leaders might be playing this game, they're just focusing on their own, domestic ambitions. I think it's going to become more and more obvious that this is definitely hurting the United States abroad as well, and that it's not simply neutral, or it's not simply a game of how can we grab as much power as we can, but you could do this to the demise of the United States.
I have a ton more questions that I could ask, but our Q&A is definitely filling up. So let me turn that over to some of our audience members. The first question I have is, how would you characterize the Syrian civil war? And then the question is followed up with, to my mind, it was a fully autocratic government, though Bashir did indicate his government would be different from his father's and never came through.
Yeah, so it's true. So it is not the case that 100% of the time countries that experience civil wars are anocracies. It does happen sometimes in countries that are autocracies, and that was the case in Syria, but you very much had these ethnic factions. Politics in Syria was divided along sectarian lines. You had this, it's a majority Sunni country. The vast majority of Syrians are Sunnis, but the government under the Bashir family is from the Alawite tribe. and they're quite a small minority in Syria. So you had a minority, it's essentially a minority run government, a minority of the population was aggressively excluding the vast majority of Syrians. And one of the ways that did I say, I probably gave the wrong name, I know, that Assad held on to power was he presented himself as this, well-educated, Western educated, new type of Middle Eastern leader. He was cosmopolitan. He was interested in reform, and of course, he never did reform. And the war started when people did start protesting, demanding reforms. And actually, that war could have been avoided entirely if he had made enough concessions to convince people to go home. But instead of making any concessions, he sent out his goons and he started killing protesters. And that just, that served to bring average citizens out into the streets and in support of the rebel groups that were beginning to form. So that's a case where you had you very much had ethnic factionalism, and you had this government that everybody was hoping would reform, but simply refused to.
Okay. So we have a question from one of your former students, Eduardo Olivares.
Oh, hi, Eduardo.
To what extent are the factors that can trigger the probability of a civil war in the US mainly rooted in specific actors? And he says, for instance, Trumpism, or should we look at more systemic view?
More systemic. You could tell this entire story without ever talking about Trump. He's a symptom of a larger set of conditions. And if Trump hadn't emerged, somebody like Trump would have emerged. And you're seeing it now with the Republican Party. If Trump doesn't get the nomination in 2024, somebody very much like him, following his playbook, somebody like a Josh Hawley or a Tom Cotton, that's going to be the candidate. So it's going to be what we call an ethnic entrepreneur, somebody who's going to play on nationalism, somebody who's going to play on this sense amongst some of the white community of a loss of status, play on their resentment. Trump was simply a symptom of a time of enormous change and uncertainty here in the United States. where the demographic changes that are taking place are creating a sense of threat amongst some of the white population. And if it wasn't Trump, it was going to be some other politician who is going to feed that sense of fear and use that sense of threat to catapult themselves to power.
Some of these we've answered. Let's see. Have you seen countries with or without the two big predictors that were on the verge of civil war and were able to avert it?
Yes. So South Africa is a fantastic case. South Africa in the late 1980s and the early 1990s was the country that everybody who studied civil wars thought pretty much with 100% certainty was going to have a civil war. It was such an extreme example of a white minority regime. This was an anocracy. So, you know, whites had a democracy in South Africa. They could vote, but blacks did not. And so it was this partial type of democracy. And you had white parties and you had you had non-white parties. So politics was based on race in South Africa. And not only that, you had a white minority apartheid regime that when protests did break out, peaceful protests, and these protests went on for many, many years, rather than stepping back and saying, okay, we need to reform, they doubled down and instead they increased repression. And so there were Soweto riots, where you had these school children in a black township in Soweto coming out and protesting, and the government went in and just killed over 100 of them. And they did this when their television cameras, like they felt such impunity that they didn't think that it didn't matter that the world was going to see them killing children on television. And that's how deeply committed they were to maintaining apartheid. And so we thought, okay, the only way this is going to end is when the large black majority finally shifts to violence. And then the apartheid regime shifted and Botha was out and de Klerk came in, and de Klerk was given the mandate to transfer power to the majority. And I remember thinking, oh my, that's unbelievable. And so, it's not that the white minority, the apartheid regime suddenly gained a conscience. They absolutely did not. It's that economic sanctions began to hurt the white business community sufficiently that they demanded reform. And so the United States, the European community, and Japan, the three biggest trading partners of South Africa, all had harsh economic sanctions against South Africa. It was strangling profits for white businesses. And the white business community eventually had to make a decision. They could have profits or they could have apartheid, but they couldn't have both of them. And they went with profits. And they told the apartheid regime, that's it, they're not supporting them anymore. And of course, once the apartheid regime lost the support of the white business community, that's where the money is, they knew it was over, and they very quickly transferred power. And so that's a really, really interesting case. So
we have another question that asks you to talk more about religion. I know within the US context, we've been talking about race, but a lot of your book does talk about the religious cleavages throughout the rest of the world.
Yeah. Religion is another form of identity, and you do see, ambitious politicians, if the main cleavage in the country is religion, so think about Northern Ireland, they'll use that identity to gather support behind them. In the book, I talk about the worst type or the most dangerous types of factions, and I call them super factions. It's when parties are formed not only around ethnicity or race, but along religion as well and geography. So if you have a situation where ethnically, racially, religiously, and geographically groups are separated, those factions tend to be the most likely to go to war. And of course, if you think here in the United States, whites tend to be Christians, or at least the Republican Party is seeking to represent whites, evangelical Christians, and most of the party is geographically concentrated in rural areas. That, by our definition, is a super faction.
So another question we have in the Q&A is, what characterizes a healthy, strong democracy? You mentioned that in order for us to get back on track, that one of the pathways is to strengthen our democracy. So how do we know when we've gotten there?
Well, I mean, there's so many features that go into a strong, healthy democracy, but I can tell you where our democracy is particularly weak. We're particularly weak in terms of executive constraints. Our executive branch of government has been becoming much more powerful than the other branches for decades. This preceded Trump, although Trump attempted to concentrate more power in the executive branch. The founding fathers, when you read the Federalist Papers, they were very clear that the main check on executive power was going to be our legislature, Congress. And the main way that Congress could check the president would be, for example, one of the main ways was to demand information and subpoena the president. And when Trump in 2019 was subpoenaed by Congress, not only did he ignore all those requests, but he counseled all of his staff to ignore them as well. And so when you have an and the Republicans in Congress backed President Trump up, which is, from a power perspective, if you think about power, that is essentially like those senators handing over their power to the president and absconding on their important check on presidential power. And so we have a much more powerful president than many democracies, and in particular, many parliamentary democracies. And we have so many undemocratic features in our government. But parties in the United States are in charge of local elections. They get to determine what days the elections are held. They get to collect mail-in ballots and count ballots. They get to run the elections. I mean, there's such a huge conflict of interest there. And you really don't see that in most healthy democracies. Canada, which is an enormous country, it does what lots of other healthy democracies do. It has an independent commission that that runs elections throughout Canada. They're run exactly the same way on the same day, and parties can't even get close to counting those votes. And so what that does is it builds trust in the outcome of election, because people know that local parties didn't get their hands on the elections. I mean, those are just two examples, but really, it's when you think about this, you're just like, how is that even possible that we allow parties and partisan politics to inject themselves in elections? And we do.
There's a question that kind of touches on that. And the question asks, can you share some action steps? So it sounds like one would be to figure out how to shift from partisan controlled elections to an independent, nonpartisan infrastructure.
Yeah.
What else can we do?
Well, I mean, voting is still important. The 2020 elections had the highest turnout in a very long time on both sides, Republicans and Democrats, and still about 80 million Americans didn't vote. I mean, that's an enormous number. And so, if more people simply went out and voted, if all of those people went out and voted, it would change the makeup of the Senate. It would change the makeup of the House of Representatives. It would probably change the makeup of a number of state legislatures. And that might allow reforms to actually be pushed through. So we still have a long way to go in terms of getting people to participate even in elections. And then I actually would encourage your listeners to look up a woman named Erica Chenoweth. She's a professor at the Kennedy School. She is just amazing. And she has spent her life studying peaceful resistance, the nuts and bolts of peaceful resistance, how you do it, what's effective, what works. She writes beautifully. She's really accessible. And I think, I think that's another, I mean, it would be great if we didn't have to actually protest and demand change from our politicians, but I think it might come to that. And we have manuals. We understand how to do that effectively. And people simply need to know about that.
I would be remiss if I didn't also bring in the other part of this, which is climate change.
Oh,
So
yeah.
you talk about climate change playing a major role in what may happen.
Yeah, so I talked about how the U.S. is in the midst of this transition from being a white majority country to being a white minority country, and that this is going to go through the entire white world. And the reason why people think it's going to happen, not just here, but even in places that are still pretty lily white, like Europe, is because of climate migration. That if you think back to 2015, when Europe had the refugee crisis, which led to the rise of lots of far-right parties there and lots of hate crimes, that was precipitated in large part by civil wars, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Syria, the war in Iraq. But the World Bank issued a report, and a number of other organizations have talked about the effects of climate change, things like droughts, for example. And the global South is likely to be disproportionately affected by the negative effects of climate change, making many parts of the global South uninhabitable and pushing people out. If we lived in a place that had a drought for many years, we would move too. And people are smart. They move to places, to countries that are rich, and they move to countries that are democracies where they know they're going to have rights and freedoms. And wealthy democracies tend to be predominantly white. So climate change is likely to precipitate a large movement of people from the global South to the global North.
I think we have time for one more question. And the one I see is, should we be nationalizing federal elections? In the sense that, should all the states just adopt uniform election laws?
Yes. And we should have an independent commission in charge of it. We should do what Canada did. And Canada wasn't always like this. They reformed sometime in the last few years. So we know how it can be done. We know how it's done. We have lots of really, really good models. But of course, this is likely not to happen because the current system benefits predominantly the Republican Party. And if you want to try to overturn elections, which we know President Trump tried to do, and which we know many Republicans in Congress were supportive of, if you want to overturn elections, the last thing you want is an independent election commission, because then you can't meddle, and currently you can meddle.
Awesome. So I think that's all we have for now. Is there anything, one final concluding remark you want to make? Mine is go get this book.
Oh,
most definitely.
My concluding remark is that, I love this country. We all love this country. This country has the ability to be a truly great country. And because we are the first that's going to go through this transformation, but so many others are following, that we have the ability to lead by example. And we've seen this transformation happen in some of our own states. You know, California, where I live, is a white minority state. Texas is a white minority state. We have made the transition in some of our states, and we've come out on the other end, you know, strong and healthy. And I'm really, really glad and grateful that this book is resonating, because it gives us time to do something about it.
Thank you so much, Barbara. It was a pleasure being able to engage with you on this topic. And you know, I look forward to more discussions about this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tasha. And your questions were great. And thank you for the discussion.
And I want to thank you both. Thank you so much for your clarity. This is such an important conversation. I feel like there's nothing more urgent than knowing the title of your book, How Civil Wars Start. So I thank you both so much for the dozens of takeaways from this conversation. It was very powerful. And I want to let everybody know that we did record this. It will be on the Center for Brooklyn History YouTube page tomorrow. And I hope that you'll check out the other things that are coming down the pike. We have a conversation about forced migrations of the Lenape next week. And following that, we're going to take a look at 5 years, where we are now, 5 years after Standing Rock, and all sorts of other things coming up. So please explore. Again, thank you for your work, both of you, for this powerful conversation and for your important work. And we support you in that. And have a good night. Have a good night, both of you, and have a good night, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.